Hi everybody, it's Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au and this is the live Q&A, your opportunity to throw your questions at me about any real estate issue that interests you, or perhaps you want to ask about a particular location where you might own real estate, wondering how it's going, what the prospects are for growth, or indeed a location that you're interested perhaps in purchasing an investment property or home and would like to know what I think its prospects are moving forward. I only do this once a month, so if you don't take the opportunity tonight to throw your questions at me, you're going to have to wait till next year for the next one. So please key in your questions on the comments panel that you'll see in front of you underneath the image of me talking at you all, and I'll see the questions as they pop up and do my level best to answer them, whether they be about pressing issues, about what's happening, perhaps what's really happening with prices around the country, whether they're rising, where they're falling, what we expect to happen next year. Or if you're like most people, you probably want to ask a question about location, and if you're one of those people, I would request that that you give us a little bit of information about the location that you're asking about. Sometimes people just give you the name of the suburb, what do you think? And it's sometimes, although I know locations around Australia pretty well, I don't always know instantly what you're talking about. So if you give us a bit of context, and also sometimes there's more than one location in the country with that particular town or suburb name. So Alison has been the first to show up tonight. Thanks, Alison. Asking about Dunlop in the ACT, prices rising or steady, should we hold or sell? Well, generally speaking, Alison, if you own perhaps an investment property somewhere in Canberra, I wouldn't be rushing to sell it. Certainly Canberra is one of the stronger markets and capital city Australia at the moment. It's got lots in its favour, strong underlying economy, very low vacancies. It's one of the two cities where rents are rising strongly as a result of very low vacancies. Hobart's the other one. Strong, busy market, rising sales activity, and there is evidence of steady price growth happening right now. So I certainly think that there are prospects for future growth there moving forward. I know a number of forecasters have predicted that Canberra is going to show good growth in the next few years. Domain put out its forecast earlier this week. Domain being one of the major data collectors and disseminators of price information and other real estate data, and also they host one of the major websites for properties for sale. And they put out their forecast for next year and the following year, and in terms of the housing market, predicting sort of solid to moderate growth in Canberra next year and the following year. So if they're right and others like them, then there's some good prospects. But just looking at, you asked specifically about Dunlop, and I have sort of a ready reckoning here on prices in different locations around Australia. According to this information, Dunlop has a median house price of about $590,000. It's grown 9% according to these figures, which are sourced from CoreLogic. It's grown 9% in the last 12 months, including a couple of percent in the most recent quarter, which indicates that prices are still nudging upwards. That's fairly typical figures for Canberra at the moment, sort of moderate to solid growth, and still rising. And I'm kind of expecting Canberra to do pretty well next year. So if you own property there, I'd suggest that maybe hang on to it. Certainly no reason to rush to sell. You're probably going to get some more growth going forward. Keeping in mind that contrary to the media headlines, we don't have prices falling across Australia. We don't have a falling property market in Australia. We have falling prices in Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne. But elsewhere in Australia, most of the capital cities have rising prices, and many regional areas have very strongly rising prices. Very different to the scenario in Sydney. Unfortunately, most of our media comes out of Sydney, and they're very self-obsessed down in the big city, and they just think that what's happening with them is pretty much Australia. Well, it isn't. There's over 20 million Australians who don't live in Sydney, and get over yourself, guys, and start giving some attention to the many other worthy locations in Australia where different things are happening, including, in some cases, strongly rising prices. George is asking about Waterford West in Logan City. Logan City being the local government area that encapsulates the southern suburbs of the Brisbane metropolitan area, forms the urban bridge between Brisbane City and the Gold Coast. Generally a very affordable area. Down there in Logan City, still plenty of suburbs with median house prices in the 300,000, so it attracts home buyers, first home buyers for its affordability. Also investors, because prices are affordable and the rental yields are much stronger than you might get in the bigger cities. So Waterford West, just looking at the numbers there, median house price 375,000, George, and according to these figures, it's risen about 4% in the last 12 months, so showing sort of moderate growth, fairly typical for what we've seen around Logan City in the last 12 months. It's grown about 30 to 35% in the last 5 years, so it's been a steady market showing solid growth, but obviously not a boom market. Nowhere in Brisbane has been a boom market over the last 5 years. At Sydney and Melbourne have been booming. Different things happening in Brisbane, although we do kind of expect better things next year. Time will tell. Alan, asking what I think of Stafford Heights or Logan Reserve. Look, I have to tell you that I generally don't have strong opinions on individual suburbs. People very often ask about an individual suburb as if it's like an island and that it's going to do something that nowhere around it's doing. It doesn't happen like that in real estate. It's very rare for an individual suburb to do something that's not also happening in its neighbouring suburbs, because they're all influenced by the same thing. It's all about what's happening locally, the local economy, local infrastructure. Neighbouring suburbs tend to be similar in terms of pricing. So, you know, I don't have any particular opinion about an individual suburb like, say, Logan Reserve. I do have an opinion about the Logan local government area, which is, as I just said when talking about that earlier question about Waterford West, it's very affordable. It's got very good infrastructure. There are lots of major jobs nodes down in that area. Not everybody works in the Brisbane CBD or any CBD. Most people work in suburban jobs nodes, and Logan City's got lots of them. Great motorway and rail links both north and south, north to central Brisbane, south to the Gold Coast. Lots going for it, and lots of reasons why people might be interested in buying an affordable home there or an affordable investment property. Just to give you, Alan, a little bit of an indication of, say, Logan Reserve figures here. Median house price 410,000, and according to the CoreLogic data, it's risen 5.5% in the last 12 months, or sort of about 35% in the last 5 years. Very similar to the numbers I just gave for Waterford West. So yeah, these places are kind of typical of what you find in Logan City, suburbs with median prices in the 300,000s. I do suggest that if people are interested in buying there, that they generally speaking go for the older, longer established suburbs, because they tend to be close to the transport spine. The transport spine is the motorway heading from Brisbane to the Gold Coast, and also the train line connecting the two places tends to follow the same corridor. Not exactly, but tends to. And so those older suburbs are closer to those main transport options, and also close to where the big retail is. Lots of big retail lining the motorway, and also where the big jobs nodes are. as opposed to heading west to the new suburbs where there's lots of fine-looking new house and land packages and duplexes to entice investors and home buyers, but there's not much in the way of infrastructure out of there, and you wonder where the growth's going to come from. Okay, Simon, what do you feel about the southwest corridor from Campbellton out to Brindley with the new airport? Yeah, well, what we're saying to people, Simon, if you are interested in buying in Sydney for whatever reason, and I would certainly suggest if you're an investor, consider somewhere else, because certainly Sydney's had all the growth it's going to have for a while. But if you are going to invest in Sydney, then one of the good options is, well, generally the theme is follow the infrastructure trail, buy real estate that lies in the path of progress. Where the infrastructure is going, the new airport at Badgerys Creek is going to be a big, big influence. And so we've already seen, we've seen a lot of value growth in Sydney over most of the last 5 years until recently. But the biggest growth that's been seen anywhere in the Sydney metropolitan area has been in areas close to where the new airport's going to go. It's going to be not just a new airport, but a massive, massive jobs node. Lots of other stuff is going to spring up around that airport. So real estate with reasonable proximity to it is probably going to do better than many other areas in Sydney in the next few years, I think. So strategic investing with that in mind, Simon, could be a good idea. And Annie is asking, how's the Sunshine Coast going? I'm less than 5 minutes from the new hospital, 10 minutes by bike. Well, not a bad place to be, Annie. Look, the Sunshine Coast is going really well as an economy and as a property market. It is undoubtedly the strongest property market in Queensland right now. It's really pumping. And you mentioned the new hospital, and you live quite close there. Well, the new hospital has been incredibly influential. It's a game changer. It's not the only thing that's changed things for the Sunshine Coast, but it's probably been the single biggest thing that's changed the momentum for the Sunshine Coast. It used to be basically a tourist resort town, and that means a fairly fragile economy, very susceptible to economic winds of change, bad weather. You can have a bad tourist season and everything suffers. But now the Sunshine Coast is becoming a well-rounded, a genuine regional city with more to its economy than just tourism and real estate construction. So we now have this great big medical precinct, not just the new hospital, but the private hospital built next to it, all the other specialist clinics that have sprung up around it. Hotels have been built close to it. Now residential is clustering around it. It's created a whole new precinct. Lots of new people have come to live on the Sunshine Coast to work in these facilities, many of them earning really good money because they're medical professionals, and they're looking for places to live, either to rent or to buy. And that's really helped to boost the Sunshine Coast market. There's lots more happening. There's the $500 million to be spent on the airport. Right now, there's $1 billion being spent on the motorway. There's the Maroochydore CBD project, which is now underway, and that's going to go on for the next probably 20 years or more. Big project. Lots more happening. We add it all up, it's over $20 billion of investment, and it's really changed the economy of the Sunshine Coast, and it's gone from being sort of place that I wouldn't recommend, even though I live near there, to a place which is we've included in our national top 10 best buyers report over the last couple of years, and it's responded with most suburbs on the Sunshine Coast having delivered double-digit growth in their median prices in the last 12 months, and more growth to come, I believe. Okay, Joanne, any opinion about the proposed fast-speed rail? New South Wales Premier has announced she'll fund another investigation into it. I realise it's super expensive, but surely help solve housing affordability better than banning migrants. Well, whatever happens with the fast speed rail, Joanne, it's not going to happen anytime soon. What you're suggesting, the government's undertaken to fund another investigation. Well, the investigation will take a couple of years, and then the planning will take more years. So it's not going to happen probably inside the next 10 years. So it's a long way off. But generally, what I would say in terms of what you're suggesting is that, infrastructure like that can be incredibly influential. Sydney's already got a lot of it going on. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there are multiple reasons why Sydney had the big boom that it had, and bearing in mind that lots of places around Australia didn't have a boom at all. Brisbane didn't, Adelaide didn't, Perth didn't. Perth was going backwards, Darwin was going backwards, Canberra hasn't boomed. Sydney did. Why? What's the difference? Well, there are multiple reasons, but I think the biggest single one was the infrastructure spend. There's been massive spend on infrastructure, new rail links, new motorways, expansion to existing facilities, universities, hospitals, you name it, tens of billions of dollars. Enormous generator of economic activity, creates jobs, new people come into work on those jobs, both in the construction of the facilities and also the operation of the facilities once they're finished, and that creates massive demand for real estate. That coupled with the strong overseas migrant intake, the strong underlying economy and all of that. But so that kind of infrastructure, Joanne, is very influential. Just that the project you mentioned is going to be a long time before it actually comes to fruition, I suspect. But there is other infrastructure happening right now, like the new airport is going to happen much sooner. It's already really essentially underway. There's a Northwest Rail link, which is getting close to being finished, and lots of other things. In terms of addressing affordability, which is one of the points you're driving at, I think one of the keys, most of the causes of poor housing affordability are actually caused by the politicians. All three levels of government milk the housing industry for revenue. It's a favourite cash cow for all of them, and that pushes up the cost of new dwellings. We also have a zoning system, and that again comes down to the politicians, both at a state and a local government level, which our zoning system mitigates against density in our existing suburbs. It forces the new development out to the fringes where people don't necessarily want to live. And because there's no infrastructure out there, you've got to provide it. How do we fund the new infrastructure? We slug the housing industry with new taxes and charges, and that just pushes up the cost of new dwellings even more. And therein lies the nub of the housing affordability problem. Joanne, do I think it'll ever happen? Well, it may do. I mean, we are seeing new rail projects built. The Northwest Rail Link in Sydney, which is a $10–12 billion project, has been underway for a couple of years, getting close to being finished. That's happened. The Inland Rail Link from sort of Victoria up into Queensland, essentially that's kind of underway, work's happening there. So these things do happen. They take a long time. They take a long time because, the planning, the logistics, you've got to buy up land to create the corridor for the rail project. That's very expensive. It's all sorts of reasons why it takes a long time. So not any time before the year 2020, that's for sure. Yeah, Joe, you mentioned Canberra and Sydney, and our less travel part would be fantastic. Yeah, really fast rail would be good. It means people can, anyone who's been to Europe and experienced rail and particularly the more modern parts of Europe, like in France, the TGV, the very fast train. Most people getting around countries like France, they don't fly. It's much faster and cheaper and easier just to jump on a very fast train, and you can be pretty much anywhere in the country in an hour or so. So it'd be great to have that in Australia. The problem is we've got a very large country with a very low population compared to European countries, and it's very hard to fund these very, very big projects. So anyway, we have a question here. between the Docklands and East Melbourne, so what do you think is better for investment? Look, hell, I don't know. I'd have to do a bit of an investigation to come to some conclusions there. I don't necessarily think either is a great place for investment, particularly right now. Why particularly that area? I would question. Why not, if you're looking to buy an investment property, why Melbourne at all, given that Melbourne has clearly been through 4 years of big growth. It's not going to be getting any more big growth anytime soon. Prices, generally speaking, not in all areas of Melbourne, but generally speaking, prices are falling. Not that much, but they're certainly not growing. And they're unlikely to be growing majorly in the next couple of years. Some forecasters have Melbourne sort of returning to growth sometime next year, but it's not going to be a big growth. Why not regional Victoria? Lots of big growth happening out there, much more affordable, much better rental yields. Why not Adelaide? Very underrated market, very affordable, better rental yields. There's growth coming to that market. Regional New South Wales, Perth recovering, Brisbane likely to show better things next year. Lots of options. I wouldn't be considering inner city Melbourne at all for investment at this point. Marcus, thoughts on Tweed Heads, just being over the border from the Gold Coast, I assume you mean, and getting a first home owners grant. Will it drag first home buyers over the border? Well, I suppose if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. There might be some element of that, but I don't think, I don't know. It's not something I'm certainly aware of that's happening. You know, Tweed Heads has been a pretty solid market in its own right for its own reasons. It's got lots of qualities. I'm just trying to find the right page on my Ready Reckoning on price here to see if I can, like Tweed Heads house prices, Marcus. Median price for Tweed Heads is 700,000. It's grown 7.5% in the last 12 months. Tweed Heads South, median price 535,000, up 4%. Tweed Heads West, $550,000 a median house price, which has grown according to these figures 11% in the last 12 months. So some pretty solid growth happening in that market. I know there's lots of other parts of the Tweed Head market, but those are just three examples, three suburbs of Tweed Heads in the name, where prices are relatively affordable. There's growth. The big debate down there at the moment is the hospital, yes or no, and where you're going to put it seems to be the issue that's dividing the community down there. Yeah, I mean, the Tweed Heads has always been, even though it's across the border into New South Wales, part of the Gold Coast general precinct. But I don't think there's any particular uplift to be got from the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast had a kind of a mini boom in the lead up to the Commonwealth Games because of all the construction of infrastructure for the Games and other infrastructure as well, which created lots of jobs, brought new people into work on those projects. And so there was certainly a substantial boost to the property market for a couple of years. But since the Games has happened, it's all sort of kind of dissipated, plateaued out. Not a great deal happening. So I don't think there's any particular uplift to be got from the Gold Coast at the moment. Troy, anything positive coming for Gladstone? Yes, the question I get asked all the time, Troy. Look, the first thing that has to happen in all these like central Queensland and other Queensland markets sort of impacted in various ways by the resources sector is, you know, the vacancies have to drop. Once the vacancies get down to acceptable levels, then rentals can start to have reasons to grow, and out of that, prices can start to grow, and when the oversupply has been soaked up, then sales activity will pick up. So Gladstone has brought its vacancy rate down a lot. It's now down at sort of acceptable benchmark levels. It was sort of 9 or 10% at one point a few years ago. gradually has been coming down, but we still haven't seen any evidence of uplift in sales activity and no evidence that the price decline has halted yet. It's been a long and brutal downturn, and I feel for anyone who owns property there, but it's just that there was such a massive distortion caused in that market. You know, a relatively small regional city had 3 projects totaling $60 billion in investment, tens of thousands of jobs created in the construction of them, just a massive distortion to the economy and the property market, and it just threw everything out of whack. It would have been far better for Gladstone, would have had much more benefit, certainly in its property market, if there'd been, you know, just a couple of moderate-sized projects, you know, a few hundred million or a few billion, but 60 billion in a place that size, it just, and developers went crazy, built too much new stuff, and found that most of the people working on those projects weren't renting or buying in the local market. They were staying in accommodation camps anyway. So it's taken a long time for that distortion to work through and allow Gladstone to recover. But now that vacancies are down at acceptable levels, you'd have to think that, and prices are down at pretty enticing levels for anybody new coming in. So you'd have to expect that in 2019 things are going to improve. Troy, I certainly hope so. Sorry, John, what you've just written there about last night's live piece all about Gladstone. Sorry, the message isn't clear. Perhaps you could put it in again. I'm not quite sure what you're trying to tell me there. Sorry, Tiao, you're the one who asked earlier about sort of Docklands as an alternative. Looking into investment into Melbourne, because my daughter may be moving there for work. Well, fair enough. So you're buying for that reason. Well, that makes sense. So maybe in sort of an inner city apartment makes sense from that perspective. If you're buying for that extra reason, I just don't think there's going to be massive capital growth there. There was an expectation that those markets were going to be oversupplied and that there was going to be high vacancies. It hasn't really materialised as yet. You know, it's pretty competitive pricing there, so you can probably buy pretty well, and it makes sense from the viewpoint of having a member of your family living there. You mentioned that you have invested a fair bit into Perth. Am I still positive about Perth, given that the market seems to be sliding back a bit? Well, actually, I don't think it is. So one of the problems, a lot of people get their information from tuning into mainstream media, and mainstream media seems to quote one research source to the exclusion of all the others, mainly because that research source pumps out more press releases than everybody else, not because their data's any better than anybody else's. And their figure has... their data still has Perth in the negative, but other sources disagree. A number of other reputable, credible sources have Perth house prices now back in the black. They're actually rising again. And what I know to be true through the research that I've done is, firstly, the sales activity has picked up a lot, so recovery is underway. Vacancies have come down a lot, so that's another recovery sign. There's evidence now that rentals are starting to rise again, another recovery sign. And probably the biggest one of all is that the top end of the market, the $1 million suburbs, many of them, most of them in fact, have had double-digit growth in their median prices in the last 12 months. So I don't agree that the Perth market seems to be sliding back. It's just that that's what the figures from one source tends to indicate, but I think their figures are rubbish, and they're contradicted by all the other information that's out there. So I think Perth is definitely moving into recovery phase. The economy is improving, jobs are being created again, the resources sector's starting to pump again, and that's feeding into Perth. All sorts of positive signs. There's infrastructure There's investment in retail, all sorts of positive signs for Perth, and I just think it's going to go forward from this point onwards. So you can disregard some of those statistics that that you may have read about. And as I say, media tends to quote one research source and ignore most of the others. An example of that was, I might have mentioned earlier that earlier this week, Domain published its forecast for the next couple of years, what they expect to happen to property prices in the major cities of Australia next year and the following year. And their forecasts are pretty positive compared to some others that are out there in the media. And the significant thing is that mainstream media didn't report these numbers at all. They're only interested in reporting the people who are forecasting a collapse in prices. They'll be on the front page. This very reputable, very credible source putting out calm, reasonable, rational, well thought out forecasts backed up by research rationale, completely ignored because it wasn't a screaming negative. Now they're forecasting that Perth house prices will rise overall about 5% next year, and they're also predicting small to moderate growth in apartment prices, similar for the following year. I actually think Perth will probably do a bit better than that. These sorts of forecasts are always very conservative. Forecasters prefer to understate rather than overstate the predicted growth. I mean, BIS, which often does forecasts sort of 3 months in advance, 3 years rather in advance, with their reporting very conservative forecasting. The outcomes are usually more than their forecast, and they prefer, I think it's something they do deliberately because they don't want to be predicting 15% growth and the growth turns out to be only 8%. So I think better things are happening for Perth than the reported figures are showing, and be mindful that there's more than one source of price data. There's 4 or 5 major credible sources and they often have different figures. In fact, I might have an example here. In the upcoming edition of the Ryder report, which is my monthly newsletter report, new edition will be coming out very, very soon. And I do a comparison on the prices and rents. I mean, this is a copy of that page that's going to appear in the upcoming report, where I compare price data from 4 different major sources for each of the capital cities and their house markets and their unit markets, to highlight the point just how different and contradictory often these figures are. They never agree on how much a market is rising or falling, or even if a market is rising or falling. And not everyone has Perth in the negative. The Australian Bureau of Statistics doesn't. SQM Research doesn't. The Real Estate Institute has their figures show that Perth house prices rose last month and the previous month. But a couple of the other major sources like CoreLogic and Domain still have Perth house prices just a little bit in the negative, but most sources don't have them in the negative anymore. Keep that in mind. So but in particular, keep in mind that the data published by one source isn't fact. It's just an opinion from one source, and be aware that another source can come along and have completely different figures. There's lots of examples here, like the Hobart apartment market. 4 sources with figures on how much the prices in Hobart apartments have changed in the last 12 months. One says they've dropped 6%, another says they've grown 10%, another says they've grown 13%, another says they've grown 15%. So a range of -6 to +15. One source says the Hobart apartment market is falling a lot, and then another source says it's having a runaway boom. So who do you believe? But be mindful that that's the norm with real estate statistics. It's all rubbery figures to a certain degree. You can't go and base big decisions on what these some of these idiotic research companies publish as gospel truth, and media doesn't scrutinise and doesn't ask any hard questions. It just presents it to the public as fact, and it's simply not. It's simply not. It's all dodgy data to a certain degree. Okay. Aaron is asking my thoughts on Bunbury. Yeah, well, it's been a long time since Bunbury done anything in real estate. It's just, well, I mean, it's not alone. Perth has been in downturn for 3 or 4 years, and regional Western Australia has done likewise. Bunbury has just sort of been stuck in going nowhere in terms of pricing, perhaps down a little, but certainly it hasn't had the collapse in pricing that some of those northern parts of Western, the resources-related sectors like Port Hedland and Karratha had massive price decline because they just went so high in the boom, whereas Bunbury didn't do that. But it's just going nowhere. Needs some really big projects to happen to generate some economic activity and bring in new people to work there, and then prices might start to move. But so far, not a lot of evidence that the market there is moving at the moment. But that may change because the WA economy is improving, and Perth market is, I think, picking up and will be much stronger in the year to come, and that may ripple out to maybe to Mandurah and maybe further south to Bunbury. But Bunbury does need, it's not all about what happens in the capital city, needs some local economic oomph to be happening. So maybe something will happen around, it's got a big export port and there's plenty of potential there, but it's just been a bit stuck like so many other parts of regional Western Australia in the last several years. Okay. Okay, and my thoughts for Toowoomba and also Surat Basin. Yeah, okay, well, firstly, Toowoomba. Toowoomba a few years ago had a bit of a spurt. I mean, Toowoomba's a really good place. It's one of those regional centres I like a lot because it's quite large. It's got lots of diversity to its economy. It's sort of self-contained. It's not sort of influenced. It doesn't sort of follow what happens in Brisbane. Toowoomba is a regional city in its own right. Some good things have happened there that are going to stand it in good stead for the future, particularly the new airport. That's a real game changer. Will have long-term positive impacts. The second range crossing, big project happening right now. When the inland rail line comes through, it's almost certainly going to be coming through Toowoomba. That'll have a long-term impact. I think what brought Toowoomba's previous charge to a halt was that developers, as so often happens, they read about Toowoomba having a bit of a boom, so lots of developers dived in there and perhaps built too many new houses and sort of dampened the market down a bit. But I think it's showing signs now of sparking up again. We follow Toowoomba quite closely. We're always looking for signals that markets like that are going to be moving one way or the other. And my gut feel, based on what I'm seeing coming through about Toowoomba, is that Toowoomba is going to move into another growth phase soon. Just feels like it without having sort of sat down and written a definitive report about it lately. It's just looking more positive, and there's lots of projects, and the significance of developments is that they create jobs and economic activity, and there's lots of sort of small to medium-sized stuff happening in Toowoomba, in addition to some of the big things like the second range crossing, and hopefully one day, not too far away, the inland rail, because that will be a game changer. So yeah, I'd if I owned real estate there, and I'd be hanging on to it. The Surat Basin, well, that's one of those places that a little bit like Gladstone and other parts of central Queensland. Resources boom, developers thought, you beauty, what an opportunity. All these people are going to be working, in the case of the Surat Basin, all these gas projects, so they're all going to be looking for somewhere to live. So let's build lots of new houses and townhouses. What they didn't understand is that the resources boom wasn't going to last forever, but more particularly that most of those resources workers weren't renting or buying local accommodation. They were being accommodated in temporary camps set up by the resources company. And so places like Chinchilla and Dalby and Roma and Miles all ended up with big oversupplies, massive vacancies. Now, the indications are that most of those oversupply has been soaked up. The vacancies will come way back down. Resources sector is cranking up again. So better things coming to those towns in the Surat Basin. I notice from our quarterly research and sales activity, and that Dalby, for example, sales activity, so the number of sales happening quarter by quarter is picking up quite significantly over the past year, and that's a sign that the market's coming back, and you're going to start to see a return to some price growth. But yeah, some of those towns took a big hit for all the reasons I've just said. Better things on the way. Leanne's asked me about what about Cairns. Well, what about Cairns, Leanne? I'm very bullish about Townsville. Cairns, good place as well, but doesn't have as much coming up as Townsville does. Cairns is just keeping on, trucking along pretty nicely. It's not as diversified in its economy as Townsville, but it does have very good rental yield, some of the best in the country, in fact. That's an attraction. But there's nothing massive happening there to really take it, whereas Townsville's got like 25 or more billion dollars worth of infrastructure and other projects sort of happening. The new stadium's being built, the water pipeline project, expansion of the seaport, expansion of the airport, expansion of the university, the military economy is expanding. It's kind of a headquarters city for many of the big resources projects that are cranking up now. So seems to me it's got more upside. It's the one that I'm more interested in than Cairns. That's not to say that Cairns doesn't have good potential. I think it does. But I just think that if I had to choose between the two, I'd be opting at this point for Townsville until something new and major comes along for Cairns. So Shane, you're the Caboolture Hospital area. I'm not sure what you're asking about there. Caboolture Hospital, what's happening there? I'm certainly interested in the university campus a little bit south of there, and some other things happening in the area, but I'm not quite sure what you're driving at there, Shane. Perhaps you could bang in another comment there and just expand on that so I can be a bit more helpful. Diego's asking what my thoughts are on areas like Penrith with the new airport coming. You say in 9 years. I think it's going to be sooner than that. I mean, work's sort of underway there. Anyway, well, yeah, Penrith. Lots of reasons why Penrith long-term is going to do well. The Western Sydney economy is massively strong. It's one of the biggest economies in the nation, and it's a growing economy. Infrastructure spending is a big driver. Lots of things happening out there. The new airport's one of them, but there's new motorways planned. The local council has ambition. I think it's an underrated factor, actually, in terms of whether an area is going to excel as an investment area. And to a certain degree, it's got quite a bit to do with the attitude of the local council. If they're progressive, ambitious, wanting the area to grow, to create jobs, to bring in new people to live there, that can help. And I think that Penrith has a council like that. They've certainly changed their local area plan recently to sort of encourage new things to happen. and yeah, it doesn't hurt to be proximate to where the second Sydney airport's going to go at Badgerys Creek. So long term, I think Penrith is going to do pretty well. And of course, relative affordability by Sydney standards doesn't hurt as well. Annie coming back, talking about the Sunshine Coast. So thinking maybe of what, perhaps renovating the place or going and heading for somewhere like Landsborough. Train station, yep. Small acreage. Yeah, I'm just not sure. I mean, Annie, I live in Mullaney, so not very far from Landsborough, about 10 minutes away. I think Mullaney's a great place to live. I don't see it as an investment hotspot. It's not really, I'd never recommend it to people as a place to invest, but as a place to live. It's an economy that's essentially about tourism and retirement and that kind of thing. And Landsborough's a little bit different. It's, it's a railway town, that helps. But, it's not a particularly go ahead. There's nothing that's about Landsborough that screams out, yeah, go and invest there because it's going to take off. Yeah, I think actually, you've got a place down on the Sunshine Coast near the hospital. I think that's the place to be. That's where the action is. That's where the growth is. That's where the jobs are. That's where a lot of people are wanting to live. I think you're better off there than heading to somewhere like Landsborough. Yeah. If I had to, if I was going to do something with one of those railway towns, I'd probably choose Beerwah before Landsborough. It just has more happening, more there, more infrastructure. Shane, just Caboolture in general. Yeah, well, I mean, lots of potential there. Moreton Bay region up in the northern part of Brisbane, it's the most active market in Brisbane at the moment, has been for a while. It's very affordable, and that attracts buyers, both investors and home buyers. Good rental yields if you're an investor. Lots of jobs nodes there and not far from there. New things happening like the university campus, which I think is going to be very significant. There's, the retail offering up there keeps expanding. The North Lakes Master Plan community, which continues to evolve, including with, big bulky goods retail like the new IKEA superstore, those kind of things. There's a lot to offer up there for people on a budget for various reasons. Lots of good reasons why you might want to buy there. It's seldom like a boom market, but it's a very steady one. It's a safe one. There's just good, solid real estate there, underpinned by good infrastructure, proximity to jobs nodes, and helped by affordability. So it's definitely worth considering. I know, people, customers of ours who have bought there and are pretty happy with what they've got. Then there's areas not far from there like Deception Bay, which I think has potential to evolve into better things, and then further on out to the Redcliffe Peninsula, which I think also has great potential, particularly now that the rail line's gone through there. Okay, what are we? 7:20. We've been almost going for an hour. Doesn't time fly when you're being asked lots of questions? Yeah, so I'll just scan back through to see whether there are any that I have missed. Don't think so. Shane, you're referring to the university campus, which is down a little bit further south from Caboolture, around Petrie, I think, near where the new rail line to Redcliffe sort of branches off. No, it's not a myth. I mean, the sites that have actually, I think work's underway. Certainly the land, the site has been secured some time ago. I'm not aware of any sort of funding issues. They're expecting to have something, things being built there throughout next year. So I think it's a happening thing. I certainly haven't seen or heard anything to the contrary. So anyway, it's just one thing. I mean, it's an extra element for that market. It's not the be all and end all of the appeal of the Moreton Bay region. There's lots of other things there, such as those that I've just mentioned. There's when you look at the sales volumes figures for suburbs like Caboolture and Morayfield and Narangba, very, very popular areas. That all of those suburbs sell sort of 300 or 400 sort of houses a year. There's very steady and consistently strong demand in those places because they're just solid. They're affordable. Steady, solid quality of housing and affordable prices, good shopping, schools, everything that people need. It's got a certain stigma image, but that's just real estate snobbery. Plenty of people want to live there and love it. So median price for Caboolture right now for houses $350,000. It's grown 3 or 4% in the last 12 months. Caboolture South, similar pricing, is up 5% in the last 12 months. Just having a look at some more areas around there. Morayfield, median price about $350,000. Fairly typical of that area. A lot of suburbs with prices in the 300,000. Narangba is a little bit more expensive. Median price $480,000, which has grown about 5% in the last 12 months. So as you can see, it's a steady market, an affordable market. Prices are growing, but they're not booming. But nowhere in Brisbane really has boomed in the last few years. That may be yet to come. I think Brisbane's going to do better in the coming year. Thanks for your feedback, Annie. Okay, yeah. So you're within a short bike ride of the hospital. Good you're using your bike. Not contributing to greenhouse gases as much as some of us. But that's a good area to be if you're already there. Good for you. All right, so we're almost coming up to the hour. I'm happy to go on longer if people have got more questions they want to throw at me. I'm equally happy to go and relax and read a book or watch some TV. If there's any more questions out there, now's your opportunity because this is the last one for the year. We're not going to be doing this again until 2019. So, because I only do it once a month. So let's have your questions while you have the opportunity. I'll just wait a little while longer, and while I am waiting for a few more to come through, I'll give you a sneak preview of what's coming up in this week's edition of The Week in Real Estate. Now, every Saturday morning we send out our free weekly newsletter called The Week in Real Estate, the 5 or 6 main stories, as we see it, of what's happening in the real estate industry in Australia, and with some digital content as well, podcasts, video content. So we've already got this week's edition in production, and there's some interesting things there, including what I mentioned earlier, the Domain forecast for prices next year. Certainly they're forecasting that next year the decline in prices in Sydney and Melbourne will pretty much come to a halt, and we'll start to see the particular part of the cycle for the two biggest cities bottom out, but it's predicting pretty solid growth for some of the other cities like Brisbane and Canberra and Perth and Adelaide. There's some research from the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, PIPA, and the first home buyers, and finding that 36% of first time buyers have opted not to buy a home, but to buy an investment property as their first purchase. And that's one of the significant changes in real estate markets. In recent times, there's been a major democratic shift in that young adults today aren't making the same choices as their parents and grandparents. They're choosing, so we want to live in certain areas, so we're going to continue to rent there, and instead of going out to the suburbs where property is more affordable and buying an affordable property in the suburbs, we don't want to live out there, we want to live here, so we're going to rent, and our first property purchase is going to be an investment property, the rent vestors. But over a third of first-time buyers have actually opted to do that, according to the survey. Confirms other research, and what it shows yet again is that the Australian Bureau of Statistics has been for years undercounting first-home buyers, and Mia's been screaming that young people are priced out of the market. Look, that only X% of buyers are first-home buyers. Well, they've been undercounted in various ways. There are three types of first-time buyers out there. First-time buyers buying a new property, and they tend to be counted because they get grants. First-home buyers buying an established property who have been undercounted, and then you've got first-time buyers buying an investment property, the rent investors. They haven't been counted at all as first-time buyers. So there's a lot more people out there as first-time purchasers than the official statistics would have us believe. And according to this survey, 36% of them are actually those rent investors rather than first-time home buyers. Carolyn, you've typed in the words Perth property market. What's your question about the Perth property market, Carolyn? Would you like to sort of expand a bit, and I can perhaps give you, okay. And then a further comment from you, Bowen, Queensland. Now that Adani looks like going ahead. Well, Bowen's one of those places, yeah, I described towns in the Surat Basin earlier, and also Gladstone had a bit of a boom when the resources boom was raging, because Bowen has got the Abbott Point export port, of course. Lots of new developer stock was built there, and then the resources boom went pear-shaped, and places like Bowen went into a bit of a downturn. And I guess your question is, now that it looks like the Adani mine is going ahead, that'll be a positive thing with Bowen. Yes, you're probably right. But yeah, still uncertainty about Adani. Is it going ahead? Should it go ahead? And if it does go ahead, how big is it going to be? It looks like it's, whatever does go ahead, it's going to be a lot smaller than what they were originally talking about. But nevertheless, they will need their rail line to the export port. And so the town of Bowen is probably going to get some sort of revival out of that. Time will tell. Stuart, sorry, Carolyn, if you could just expand a little bit on, this probably you coming about what's going to happen for the next 1 to 2 years. If you're referring to Perth, or Perth, as I mentioned earlier, is moving into recovery, undoubtedly. So many indicators of that, and some of the sources of price data actually have Perth prices now rising again. It's just that the source that's most quoted in media has it still in the negative. I think they're wrong and the others are right. Perth prices are now starting to rise again, and particularly at the top end where there's been really strong growth in prices in the last 12 months. That's really clear from all the evidence. So I think we're certainly going to see growth in the Perth property market in the next 1 to 2 years, Carolyn. And I think it's a city of opportunity. I often refer to it as the city of opportunity because prices are at lower levels after a couple of years of decline. The market's starting to recover, but it's certainly not booming, so there's not a massive amount of competition. It's a good time, if you believe in the future of Perth, it's a good time to be considering buying there. Stuart's asking any thoughts on Central Queensland. They're extremely beaten down, but yeah, the resources sector coming back, buying well below the price of replacement now. Well, I think you're right, Stuart. The resources sector is definitely recovering. Central Queensland is going to be economically revitalising. We're already seeing signs of that. We're also seeing signs of rising sales activity in some of the towns impacted like that, like Emerald, like the coal mining town of Moranbah. Definitely activities picking up. Vacancies are much lower than they used to be. And you can buy well there ahead of some future growth, but you've got to be aware of how volatile those markets are. So many people bought there previously and now in property that's worth a fraction of what they paid. It's happened before, it will happen again. You've got to be aware of the risks and the volatility if you're going to buy in those markets. If you get your timing perfect, you buy at the right time and sell at the right time, you can do well, but not many people are that good or that lucky. So be aware, Stuart, that getting into that market has a whole great big element of risk. But, you know, if you've got nerves of steel and you sleep well at night and you've got perhaps 9 or 10 properties in your portfolio, you can afford to take on a bit of risk and not be too damaged if it goes pear-shaped, then by all means. But, yeah, too many people dived in. I know people who bought multiple properties in places like Gladstone and Moranbah and just, yeah, really suffering. Leanne. Looking at Toowoomba, furnished apartments look like being booked at reasonable rates. Do you recommend this as an investment? Well, I'm sure it has its merits, but it's a little bit hard to give you a definitive opinion off the cuff. I don't. I mean, imagine you thinking of that sort of Airbnb approach. I mean, Toowoomba's a very much one of the things that's strong about Toowoomba is the tourism industry. You know, the Carnival of Flowers is just one example of things, an event that brings in lots of tourists, but there's other reasons for people to visit Toowoomba and that whole region. So you might be right, but I can't really give you a strong, definitive. Oh, sorry. You've just come back and said, sorry, you didn't mean Toowoomba, you meant Townsville. Right, okay. Well, we previously talked about Toowoomba, but Townsville, yeah, I've been very positive about Townsville as an opportunity. It's been in downturn, prices are down, hasn't started to shoot up again yet, but I'm quite sure it will because of everything that's happening there and coming up there. Actually, I was in Townsville a couple of weeks ago, spoke at a seminar there. I was a little bit surprised at how the lack of energy in the place. It seems like Townsville is full of people who are so battered and bruised by the recent years of downturn and Clive Palmer's nickel refinery closing down and all of that, that they're not yet excited about the potential for that town and its economy and its property market to head north again. I've got no doubt it's going to. There's just so much happening. It cannot fail to have a rising property market. And so I think the potential there for people who get in there and buy now is very good. The buying's good and the potential for growth is good. Just be aware that you're going to be paying more for insurance than you might in some of the southern states because it's in that belt where they get those extreme weather events like cyclones. And so insurance costs are pretty hideous. It's something to keep in mind when you're buying in places like Townsville. But yeah, it's a strong tourism city, Leanne. it's got other things going on that bring people in, like the military economy, big education economy of the university, which is forever expanding. It's increasingly going to be a hub, like a headquarters town for big resources project, and that's going to bring a lot of traffic in and out of Townsville. So, yeah, an investment in furnished accommodation, that kind of approach, might be a good idea. Craig says, no questions tonight. Just want to say thanks for your content. Well, thanks, Craig, for that contribution. You sure you don't have a question? Like I keep saying, this is the last chance this year to ask me a question in this live forum. And time is running out because we've been going for an hour and 10 minutes and I'm starting to get a sore throat. And I've got a hankering to lie on the couch and read a book. Or do something other than sit here staring at a computer screen. So, yep, last chance, folks. I was just giving a couple of highlights of this week's upcoming edition of the Week in Real Estate. It's a free weekly newsletter. You can go to the website and sign up for it. As I say, it doesn't cost anything, and you get our weekly newsletter every Saturday morning. So I mentioned Domain's price forecasts, which are quite optimistic for next year, and I agree with them. I just think some of the stuff in the newspapers is just ridiculous, but they always do that because that's what they do. Sad little creatures that they are. We've talked quite a bit tonight in the context of some Queensland locations about the resources sector. There's a story in this week's edition of the Week in Real Estate coming up about sort of a mini resources boom that's been gathering steam over the past year. We're not going to have the sort of resources investment boom we had previously, which was just massive and unprecedented, with those huge gas projects in Western Australia and Darwin, and 3 of them in Gladstone, Queensland. But probably not a bad thing, actually. We're going to have something that's a little bit more sustainable and reasonable. Still some very big projects happening out there, multi-billion-dollar projects. It's just that those gas projects were like 20 billion and 50 billion in just one project, and they were just so big. But certainly investment is pouring back into the resources sector in sectors like iron ore and unfortunately coal. I wish we could find a way to do without it. I think we can do without it, but anyway, that's a whole different argument, but that's having a positive impact on the economy and jobs and all of that. Interesting story that came out of Sydney and Melbourne this week, because all the media is about how those markets are dropping, but we're also seeing stories about how some of the prestige suburbs are holding up quite well. There's a story saying there's a kind of a mini boom in our 2 biggest cities with expat Australians who are working overseas, making lots of money, wanting to buy back in Sydney and Melbourne. And the reason is that the Australian dollar has dropped so much compared to the American dollar that it makes people earning offshore, it makes it much cheaper for them to buy into Australia. One comment here is that the Australian dollar has dropped so much, it's like buying at a 30% discount if you're buying in Sydney and Melbourne. And so it seems that there's a lot of expat Australians thinking about the time when they're going to come back to Australia to live again, taking advantage of the low Australian dollar and perhaps weaker pricing in Sydney and Melbourne to buy something that appears like a bargain because of the impact of the exchange rate. So that's an interesting thing, something a little bit counter to the screaming negatives coming out of mainstream media about what's happening in real estate in the 2 big cities. Okay, final questions for this month's edition of the live Q&A. Brian, Brisbane apartment, we are beside train and ferry, a couple of stops to the city. Right now, inner city apartments, still high vacancies, still a little bit oversupplied, and pricing down, gradually the oversupply is being soaked up. So, but it depends on your motivation, Brian. If we had somebody who asked a question earlier about a similar question about Melbourne, and their motivation for buying sort of an inner city apartment was to buy something for one of their kids who sort of might be living there or going to university. If you've got that sort of motivation, there's an opportunity in the next little while probably to buy an inner city Brisbane apartment at a discounted price. If you're planning to live in it, fine. If you've got maybe an adult child, might have use for it, yeah, sure. But as an investment, there's many better places you could buy. Just look at the long-term growth rates, the 10-year growth average for, say, Brisbane CBD apartments or Fortitude Valley apartments. Give you an idea that long-term, there's not a lot of growth there. Okay, a lot of people just coming back in to say thank you. Thank you, Annie, for your thank you. Thank you, Anne, another Anne, for your thank you, and Carolyn as well. And Leanne earlier says thanks for your awesome advice. Yeah, much appreciated that you take the time not just to ask your questions, but to come back and express your gratitude for the answers. I've done my best to give you informative answers. I haven't been able to answer everyone's question as fully as I'd like, but sometimes the questions that require a person to go away and do a little bit of research before providing a definitive answer. So anyway, it's been a really good session. I've enjoyed it. I've been asked questions mostly about location, which is usually the case, but very diverse, as we've been talking about regional Queensland, we've been talking about Brisbane, we've been talking about Melbourne, Perth, Canberra, Adelaide, various other parts of Australia, and that makes it interesting. And so I've enjoyed it. That's the last one for this year because we do it once a month, and so there'll be another one happening probably more towards mid-January, just to allow for people, well, people can always tune in when they're on holidays, I suppose, but early to mid-January we'll be doing it again. So tune in again then, and let's do it again. It's always fun, and appreciate both your contributions, your questions, and also your feedback. That's it for now. I'm going to go and do something else. Have a great Christmas, everybody, and we'll do it again early in 2019. Bye for now.